What is in a baby's mind? How do babies think? Do they feel as we do? What would it be like to experience the world from this perspective?
Babies absolutely have thoughts and feelings. They can make things happen, they can predict things. They've got extraordinary capacities to understand the world, much, much more than... They understand when somebody's being kind, they understand when somebody's being aggressive, they can pick up thoughts and feelings. That's their job. That's in a baby's job description, in a way, to work out how safe the world is, what's going on in their environment, what does she think, what's he feel, in order to survive. So they've absolutely got brilliant minds.
Recent scientific discoveries are reshaping our understanding of early childhood development. Studies show that what happens in the first 1,000 days of life is biologically woven into the brain and impacts a lifetime. Neuroscience demonstrates that neural pathways set down in early life are enduring and largely irreversible.
So we're born with probably all the neurons we're ever going to have, which is probably about 100 billion. It's an extraordinary number of neurons, but what is happening the first couple of years is that the connections between these neurons are forming. So what we call synaptic connections, and they're forming in response to particular kinds of experiences.
UK-based child psychotherapist and author Graham Music teaches that very early experiences actually shape brain architecture.
The baby's brain, autonomic nervous system, neurochemical system is being programmed and developing in response to the environment it's in.
What this means is that particular pathways in the brain are activated in response to particular experiences. Good experiences set up strong, complex pathways. Bad experiences disrupt important connections in the brain. Once those pathways are set up, new science is saying there's little chance of rerouting, and all this happens in the first 1,000 days. According to psychiatrist Dr. Anusha Lakman, we should begin counting those days long before birth.
The changes, the connections, whether these are circuits that are weak or strong, are actually formed way before that.
Anusha says brain connections begin to form prenatally, twice as fast as an adult brain.
So think about 1 million neuron connections a second. And it really is that time from conception up until 18 months post-delivery. Babies are pretty smart very early on. And in utero, so during the pregnancy, babies have an automatic physiological system that allows them to buffer stressful events.
So literally, stress hormones will cross the placenta if the mother is very, very stressed, and that will change the nervous system of the baby, who'll be born predisposed to stress.
Graham says prenatal stress has been linked to a myriad of later behavioral problems, adolescent depression, anxiety disorders, and increased likelihood of autistic symptoms. Human fetuses are real beings who come into the world pre-wired with particular predispositions. One of those predispositions is that the human brain is pre-wired to relate. There is now overwhelming scientific evidence that the parent-child relationship, in particular responsive, sensitive care in the first 1,000 days, is critical to brain development.
What is fascinating about the first 1,000 days is that, to a degree, what isn't in place in that first 1,000 days cannot entirely be recovered.
Catherine Frost heads up Ububele, an NGO based in Alex which runs programs on the first 1,000 days.
Research is showing us that if babies are responded to as people from the very beginning, that those are the children that will develop.
Ububele care worker Kosi Sitole encourages parents to think about their baby's thoughts and feelings. She teaches that what a baby really needs is to be understood.
It's not just the baby, you feed the baby, change the baby, and that's it. So for somebody who doesn't know, you kind of make them aware that actually, did you know that actually when you smile to your baby, it does something to them like on the inside without getting all technical and think about neurons.
Kosi encourages caregivers to respond sensitively to their baby's attempts to connect with them.
So when a child does not get the sensitive care, how does that change the brain architecture of that child?
So the brain is use dependent. So if there are areas of the brain that have potential to grow and be used, if they aren't used, they atrophy, they fall away.
It's a case of use it or lose it. Neural pathways, much like taxi routes, will simply be discontinued if there's no demand for them.
We've known about this idea that cells that fire together, wire together. We've known that as a basic idea since the 1950s or so.
However, Graham says the nuts and bolts of it have become clear through sophisticated forms of brain scans.
We can actually see changes taking place in the brain, and we can see which parts of the brain are activated in what kind of circumstances, in what kind of children. So we can see that, for example, children who have suffered maltreatment, the parts of the brain involved in self-reflection, empathy, emotional regulation, calm, they go offline, and other more subcortical, more primitive parts of the brain involved in aggression, threat, danger, will be much more activated.
Babies who have been traumatized or regularly overwhelmed will grow up with default pathways primed to react.
Which will stop them concentrating, stop them relaxing, stop them learning, stop them being curious, stop them being kind and interested in other people. These are the kids that are very reactive, and so, for example, in school, get into fights.
They are hardwired to be on high alert.
And I want to make the point that this is not just about people that abuse children in ways that we commonly think. This is also about children growing up in an environment with constant negative reinforcement.
And what's a bit shocking is how much stress and trauma and abuse there is in so-called ordinary families as well. So what we want to do is try to increase capacities for resilience.
Blanche Resant works with families in the Western Cape to do just that. Many of the mothers she works with live in stressful, challenging environments.
And we have to be aware of that and be able to center mom and say to her, you are doing good enough work with what you're doing. How can we come alongside you to support you better?
Blanche says mother's mental health is critical to healthy brain development.
So really about this time that you're bonding with her?
If a mother is depressed, she has a very somber state. She doesn't respond very easily. A baby will gurgle and giggle, and mom will just carry on. And baby's brain pathway will then take another format to say, whether I smile or whether I gurgle, nobody's gonna come, nobody's gonna respond to me.
An experiment first conducted in the 1970s demonstrates how sensitive babies are to loss of contact. In the still face experiment, mothers were instructed to become unresponsive to their babies after a short period of play.
And when the parent or the caregiver does not respond?
Physically, the baby starts to make more exaggerated attempts to connect. At an emotional level, a baby starts to almost dysregulate. They become, as a layperson would say, oh, this baby's so difficult, what a fussy baby. Or the reverse might happen. If they have repeated episodes where nobody's noticing them, they become very withdrawn. And in fact, we worry more about the withdrawn child.
A well-known study of Romanian orphans held in appalling conditions in the late 80s yielded some of the most groundbreaking data about neglect and the developing brain.
Absolutely devastating and shocking. You can see it in their eyes, you can see it in their bodies, you can see it in their faces, and in their brains you find that many different areas of the brain just didn't develop in the way that you would hope a child's brain would develop.
They had differences in their brain capacity in terms of physical size, so their brains were smaller.
Parts of the brain involved in empathy and emotional regulation were much less activated.
Deprived of human connection, large parts of the prefrontal cortex in the institutionalized children simply did not develop.
Where you'll see big black holes in the brains of children that had inconsistent or absent caregiving in the first 1,000 days.
What the study found is that those children who were removed from the orphanage before the age of 2 made good progress.
All kinds of remediation happened in their brain pathways that didn't happen in the kids that were left behind.
Those who were adopted after the age of 2 never fully recovered.
What the research does say is that the earlier you correct things, the better it is.
For those working with babies in communities, the science is borne out in behavior.
But when we see it in the reality, you can actually see the long-term result is that prevention is much better if you start early.
Experts in the field all agree that the mitigating factor for healthy brain development in all environments is for parents to understand the emotional needs of their children. Is that always the case?
That is always the case.
What science is now saying, quite simply, is that love really matters.
It's not all touchy-feely at all. What we're talking about is hard scientific evidence for the profound effects of good and bad experiences on the brain, on the body, on the health outcomes on the cost to societies generally.
Click, click.